And another reminder, we are tweeting today, so do take a look at our hashtag RI New York. We have our handle up there at RI_news_alert. So if you are in the Twitterverse, please do keep us in mind with that. Okay, if you could please take your seats. We'll get on to our next speaker. Great. Thank you very much. If somebody could please come on in and close the door, that would be wonderful. Okay, moving right along after this morning's fabulous discussions, which I'm sure there's still plenty of questions and debates. It is a huge honor, great pleasure for us. It is a huge honor and pleasure for us to have Abigail Disney speaking today. She is an Emmy Award-winning director and producer. She's a philanthropist. She's also president and CEO of Fork Films, where she has executive produced and supported over 100 documentaries. She's an active supporter of peace building and is passionate about advancing women's roles in the public sphere. In 2009, she founded Peace is Loud, a nonprofit that focuses on advancing social movements. She's also founded the Daphne Foundation, which supports organizations improving equality for New York City. And on top of all of that, she is chair and co-founder of Level Forward, a storytelling company. So who better to tell us how investors can think more creatively about their role in driving social change. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Abigail Disney. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I have a caveat and an apology all rolled into one, which is I've been thinking about this all week, and it got more important to me as the week went on. And then, like late last night, I thought, God, I've got to write something down. I'm never going to remember all this. So I hate people who just read, but I'm gonna. I'll try to make it interesting. And as you could see, maybe me sitting up there, I was also scribbling and scratching right up until I walked up here. So there might be the occasional, what was that I said there? So be patient with me. So I have two colleagues in the room, Adrian Becker, Roger Clark, right here. And together we are starting a company called Level Forward, which is an attempt to bring to a lot of different platforms in the entertainment space a consciousness about social responsibility that crosses every factor and informs every factor of the way that we do our business. So we're not content just to make content that features women and people of color in ways they generally aren't featured. That's important. That's what I've spent most of my life working on. But I don't think it's enough. We're also focusing on how to do that in a way that is respectful, that is not money grubbing, that shares the wealth and shares the credit and does so as decently as humanly possible. Ever since we started that, I have sort of flattered myself to imagine that I'm following in my family's footsteps in doing that. In some ways, I kind of think of Disney as the original impact business. My grandfather, Roy O. Disney, had a lot to do with shaping my world view about these things. He was not as well known as my great uncle Walt, of course, but he built the foundations of the company. No Walt, no Roy, and no Roy, no Walt. He built the foundations of what you now see, which is a behemoth. As modern and as cool as we think we are at Level Forward, if he were here right now, he'd be kind of wondering what all the fuss was about. I mean, a company that cares not only about what it puts on screen or on stage, but also the manner in which it does so, the cultural context in which it does so, that pretty much sums up his whole life. What's more, if you told my grandfather that 50 years after his death, many of the people who worked at the company he founded were sleeping in their cars, or rationing their insulin, or relying on food pantries for sustenance, well, first he'd have thought you were hallucinating, then he'd have been irate, and then he would have gone right to work figuring out what the hell had gone wrong, although he wouldn't have said hell. None of this is because he was a perfect person, believe me. And from my perspective now, his politics were, to put it mildly, problematic. He was a red-baiting, McCarthy-loving, union-hating conservative who did not, for the most part, hire people of color or women. And these are not things that you can just brush aside casually. But prepare yourself for a truth bomb now. He could be a nice person and also be bad in some ways. These things can both be true at the same time. And he saw his job as the CEO of a creative company, even though he was in charge of the banking and the loans and the structure and all of that, as a co-creator. And he understood the task that he was undertaking as not extractive, but generative. He recognized that risk was not something that he was going to be able to entirely quantify or manage, and he took big, existential, life-changing risks constantly because his vision for what he and Walt were building were more important to him than his bank account. My grandmother told me that when she brought my father home from the hospital in 1930 in a little basket, she drove home in a Cadillac to a beautiful house, and she had no idea where her next meal was coming from, because that's how up to their eyeballs they were in debt. Grandpa had the great quality of not needing to be the star. The company was actually called the Disney Brothers when it first started, and he took himself out of it voluntarily because he didn't feel he should get, nor did he want the credit. He saw the studio as a community of people who drove value as partners with him, and therefore with him drove a healthy bottom line. That meant that Grandpa saw the people who worked for him, especially those that worked at the parks, which were living, breathing manifestations of the brand, as deserving of his genuine and heartfelt respect. They were his partners, not his minions. All of these were values that we are working to bring alive at Level Forward, because building a socially responsible business is as much as who you are being as of what you are doing. There are two things I remember really well about going to the park with my grandfather as a child. One was we were under threat of death. Should we back talk or smart talk or sass or whatever word you want to use any of the people who worked there? We were told very clearly that these were people who worked harder than we could ever possibly imagine, and they deserved our total and utter respect. The other was that he never walked by a piece of garbage he didn't pick up and carry to the nearest garbage can and throw away. I want you just to imagine an imperial CEO of any company right now being willing to bend over and pick up a piece of garbage. This was really important to him, and not a small thing, because it was his way of communicating that he believed that he was not above picking up garbage and that no one was above picking up garbage, and to think so would be a terrible betrayal of his deepest values. So why should it matter to you what my grandpa was like? I know you probably all had great grandpas who carried you on their backs and gave you lollipops and the rest of it. Mine just happened to preside over the building of an iconic business and one of the most enduring brands that has ever existed. And then he happened to die at a very portentous moment, 1971. Two things happened right around the time that he died that changed everything and made the world what is now, I think, unrecognizable for him if he were to come along. The first was in 1970 when Milton Friedman published an op-ed in the New York Times. So we're almost upon the 50th anniversary of that op-ed. In it, he articulated a worldview that was at the time a fringe view, but quickly came to be so embraced by the business world that I think you could describe it as orthodoxy now. That worldview was what we call now shareholder primacy. As Friedman saw it, if everybody, every company, every individual pursued their own self-interest rationally and to the best of their abilities and within the rules, society would thrive. I do urge you to Google and read this op-ed. It's a really interesting document to read now, and there's a lot to unpack, which I won't do because you'll get really bored. I was an English teacher, and so yeah, I have problems with the scare quotes he uses a lot, and yeah, he really pisses me off. But suffice to say, he dispenses with the entire notion of social responsibility in scare quotes. That's a lot to dispense with the simple use of scare quotes. And it's certainly not a rational way, in spite of the fact that he's characterizing himself as the only rational voice in the room, of dispensing with your adversaries. He sounds like, when you read it, like a grumpy old economist on his front lawn telling the kids to get off and go away. But the other thing that happened in writing too. This was in 1971 and it's called the Powell Memo. Is anyone familiar with the Powell Memo? It's not a widely known document, but it's had a massive impact on all of your lives. In 1971, the future Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, wrote a memo to CEOs across the country that said, you guys are getting your butts kicked in Washington, D.C. Labor is too powerful, regulations are too great, taxes are too high. If you don't get there and start lobbying hard, you're going to be done for. It was time to push back on all of the regulation and all the taxes and all the labor organizing, and it was time for businesses to put all their resources together and get working hard. And this memo was not broadly talked about and not widely known, but it was known and accepted quickly and entirely in every boardroom in America. There was a chorus of amens. And we all know how hard it is for businesses to pivot, but they pivoted awfully quickly on that one, interestingly enough. The reason that these are separate but totally intertwined developments is important. Neither one on its own explains where we are. I would love to lay it all at Milton Friedman's doorstep, but it's not all at his doorstep. Think about it. Friedman was urging businesses to ignore the well-being of employees, the environment, and the communities they functioned in, because that well-being would be cared for by the free market, as long as everyone abided by the rules, right? As long as everyone abided by the rules. But just as Friedman's notion was catching fire, there began a massive and well-orchestrated effort on the part of that very same cast of characters to change the very rules that Milton was referring to when he said you have to abide by them. The Powell Memo chucked the principle of a free market right under the bus by declaring open season on regulations, on labor, on taxes, on the idea that businesses should care at all for the well-being of the broader community. Instead, businesses began generating and gobbling up tax breaks, subsidies, and sweetheart deals, all of which found their way straight to their bottom line. My grandfather's passing happened to coincide with the end of an era when at least a certain amount of decency and restraint, words that kind of seem almost ridiculous now, were still welcomed in the value system that animated my grandfather's world, pun intended, was slowly, glacially, and utterly upended, inverted. We Americans are good at handling catastrophes. We will run straight down to New Orleans when there's a hurricane. We will solve the earthquake problem. But the thing we are paralyzed by is a catastrophe that is slow. Would my grandfather have been the only CEO in the world who was decent had he risen to power today? Probably not. I doubt it. Would the typical imperial CEO we know today have been forced by norms, by peer pressure, and by better governance to bring a little humility and humanity to his work? Probably yes. We have arrived at a moment when our total and unblinking embrace of what was once a fringe set of ideologies are precisely what will kill us. So what can we do about that? I would posit a lot, actually, every single one of us. I don't entirely blame CEOs for this predicament. No single CEO has the power on his own, usually his. There are more CEOs named John in Fortune 500 than there are women CEOs, after all. No one of them has the power to buck the analysts, the pundits, the politicians, the business school curricula, the social norms that require him to look like a cuddly puppy on the outside, but inside be channeling Cruella de Vil. Right now, given the way governance is structured, the way laws are written, the way litigation and jurisprudence have played out under Milton Friedman's spell, to have a conscience is to unilaterally disarm in the midst of a battle, and that's a foolish thing. Right now, choosing to be unethical is like choosing to use steroids in baseball. How can you possibly lose against all the high-minded ninnies who won't suck it up and do the right thing, I mean the wrong thing, like everybody else? You know, if you talked to my grandfather about impact investing, I suspect he'd have laughed out loud. Good Lord, everything is impact investing. Everything is impact investing. The only difference between what we call impact investing and everything else today is that the impact is good and on purpose. It is not something that's arrived at once all the bonuses and the buybacks have been executed. The difference between what we call impact investing and everything else is that the impact of so much of what we do when we're not doing what we call impact investing is kind of terrible and toxic and unsustainable. So I propose we all use our imaginations. Sorry, that's a Disney thing to say. I propose that we try to imagine that we live in a world where all investing is impact investing, all of it. I propose that we live in a world where there is no such thing as morally neutral or apolitical. There's no more political thing on earth to say, by the way, than to say that you're not political. In a world where the work that we do, all of it, is either actively good or actively bad, but never anywhere in between. How would we do things differently if we understood it that way? Would it be easy to look the other way when your company is paying your overnight shift workers who are literally, quite literally, losing their minds because of their lack of sleep? A whopping 75 cents above minimum wage, 75 cents above minimum wage as a premium for doing that job at a company where cleanliness is one of the biggest parts of the brand identity. Would that feel appropriate to you? If you were being paid that as a premium? Right now, I'm told it's appropriate because, well, the minimum wage is the minimum wage, and that's the going rate. Disney is not the only or the worst offender in this department. And the minimum wage may be the going rate. But if you consider all business to be impact business, it doesn't really sit well, does it, at all? Because if all businesses were impact businesses, wouldn't the first order of business to be do no harm? Would it be possible to say, for instance, that a company is a good thing because it donates money to the arts, if it is also actively muddying the waters on climate change and pumping and fracking us all to hell? Probably not. Now, I know I'm preaching to many of the converted. You are all here because you're trying to parse this thing out. How do we do well and do good at the same time? How do we think about ourselves as each as individuals inside of a system that feels bigger than we are? And I don't like to make you feel guilty about the things over which you have no control. But I do believe that none of us, me included, has truly stepped up and honestly done, in the words of the AA Great Book, a fearless and searching moral inventory over